It was supposed to be a simple evening out, a celebration. Marcus Evans had just closed the biggest deal of his career. With his wife, Vanessa, and their 10-year-old son, Jaden, by his side, he walked into Bellevue Steakhouse, one of the most exclusive restaurants in the city. The place was known for its 5-star service, elite clientele, and an unspoken rule about who belonged there. From the moment they stepped in, the air shifted. Conversations lowered. Eyes darted toward them. At the front desk, a tall, silver-haired man in a navy blue suit stared at Marcus with a look of thinly veiled disdain. His name tag read Richard Hastings, manager. "Can I help you?" Richard asked, his tone dripping with condescension. "Yes, we have a reservation under Evans," Marcus said, flashing a warm smile. Richard's eyes flicked down to the tablet in front of him. His fingers tapped the screen, but his expression remained blank. "Sorry, I don't see a reservation under that name." Vanessa stepped forward, concern in her eyes. "I booked it myself 2 weeks ago. I have the confirmation email." She pulled out her phone, holding it up for Richard to see. But Richard didn't even glance at it. Instead, he straightened his tie, his face tightening with forced politeness. "There must be some mistake. We're fully booked tonight." Marcus could feel the weight of the stairs behind him. He glanced over his shoulder, noticing how the staff whispered amongst themselves, how the other patrons barely concealed their disapproving looks. He knew this game. He had played it too many times before. Before he could speak, Jaden tugged at his sleeve, whispering, "Dad, why don't they want us here?" Marcus inhaled sharply, his grip tightening around his son's small hand. He looked back at Richard, who was already shifting his attention elsewhere. "You know what?" Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. "We'll take our business elsewhere." Richard smirked, nodding as if that was the answer he was hoping for. "That would be best." As the Evans family turned to leave, another couple, white, elegantly dressed, stepped up to the podium. Marcus overheard Richard's warm welcome. "Ah, Mr. Kensington, right this way. Your usual table is ready." Marcus stopped in his tracks. He turned back, his jaw tightening. Vanessa placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Let it go," she whispered. But Marcus wasn't the kind of man who let things like this go. He smiled, nodded, and walked out of the restaurant, his mind already working. That night, Richard Hastings went home, smug and satisfied. He had upheld the standard of Bellevue Steakhouse. He had kept their kind out. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, settled into his leather chair, and turned on the evening news. And then his entire world came crashing down. The lead story flashed across the screen. Local restaurant faces backlash after turning away prominent businessman and family. Richard's glass froze midway to his lips. The anchor continued, her voice laced with intrigue. Marcus Evans, the renowned billionaire investor and CEO of Evans Global Enterprises, was denied service at Bellevue Steakhouse last night. Eyewitnesses report that the manager, Richard Hastings, refused to honor the family's reservation, citing a mistake. However, sources confirm that white patrons were seated without issue. The incident has since gone viral, with thousands calling for a boycott of the establishment. Richard's face drained of color. He grabbed his phone, scrolling frantically. Social media was in an uproar. #BoycottBellevue was trending. Celebrities, politicians, even local officials had weighed in. The restaurant's Yelp page was flooded with 1-star reviews. Sponsors were pulling out. Reservations were being canceled at an alarming rate. Then his phone rang. "Richard," came the sharp voice of the restaurant's owner, Thomas Bellevue himself. "What the hell have you done?" Richard opened his mouth, but no words came out. Do you have any idea who Marcus Evans is? Thomas hissed. He's one of the biggest real estate moguls in the country. He owns half this city, including the lease on our building. Richard's heart nearly stopped. You better fix this, Thomas growled, or don't bother coming in tomorrow. Richard hung up, his hands shaking. But as he stared at the news, at the hundreds of comments tearing the restaurant apart, he realized the damage had already been done. And Marcus Evans? He was just getting started. Richard Hastings didn't sleep that night. He spent hours refreshing his phone, watching in horror as Bellevue Steakhouse collapsed in real time. The backlash was relentless. Customers were canceling their reservations. The restaurant sponsors were pulling out. Even the mayor had made a statement condemning discriminatory practices in the city. Richard tried to convince himself that this would all blow over. Social media outrage was temporary. People would forget. But when he arrived at the restaurant the next morning, he realized this was no ordinary controversy. Reporters crowded the entrance, cameras flashing as he stepped out of his car. Mr. Hastings, do you have a comment on the discrimination allegations? Is it true that Marcus Evans is taking legal action? Are you being fired for your actions? Richard shoved past them, sweat pooling at the back of his neck. Inside, the restaurant was eerily quiet. Half the tables sat empty. The phone at the hostess stand rang endlessly, likely more cancellations. He barely had time to process it before Thomas Bellevue stormed toward him, face red with rage. You arrogant idiot, Thomas spat. Do you have any idea what you've done to my business? Mr. Bellevue, we lost every major investor overnight. The board wants my head. And do you know who they want to replace me with? Thomas let out a bitter laugh. Marcus Evans. He owns this building. Richard, he has the power to evict us, terminate our lease, or buy this entire company if he wants. Richard's stomach twisted. You better hope he doesn't push this further. Otherwise, you're finished. No restaurant in this city will hire you after this kind of scandal. Richard swallowed hard. He had spent years building his reputation. Losing this job? He might as well be finished. He had to fix this. That evening, Marcus Evans sat in his high-rise office, watching the city skyline. His assistant, Jamal, stood beside him, scrolling through updates on his tablet. Bellevue Steakhouse is hemorrhaging money. Sponsors have backed out. Their stock is crashing. Jamal smirked. It's beautiful. Marcus tapped his fingers against his desk. He had expected Richard Hastings to underestimate him. He had expected Bellevue to regret their actions. But the speed at which they were falling apart? That was unexpected. Then his phone buzzed. Richard Hastings, Jamal read. Third time he's called. Marcus leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing at his lips. Let him wait. Richard sat in his car, gripping his phone like a lifeline. Straight to voicemail again. Panic clawed at his throat. He had tried reaching out to Marcus all day, only to be ignored. He needed to fix this, to make it right. There was only one option left. Richard started his car, gripping the wheel tight as he headed straight for Evans Global Enterprises. The lobby of Evans Global was sleek, intimidating, and filled with power players. Richard felt small as he approached the front desk. Name? The receptionist asked, barely looking up. Richard Hastings. I need to see Mr. Evans. She scanned the computer. You don't have an appointment. Tell him it's about Bellevue Steakhouse, Richard said quickly. It's urgent. She sighed, picked up the phone, and whispered something. After a moment, she nodded toward the elevators. Mr. Evans will see you now. Richard exhaled in relief and stepped into the elevator. Moments later, he stood in Marcus's massive office. Floor-to-ceiling windows, sleek black furniture, and a view that screamed power. Marcus sat behind his desk, studying Richard like he was nothing more than an inconvenience. Jamal leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching like a predator eyeing weak prey. Richard cleared his throat. "Mr. Evans, I came to apologize." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Apologize?" Richard nodded, swallowing his pride. "Yes, I made a terrible mistake last night. I judged you unfairly. I let my biases cloud my judgment, and I deeply regret it." Marcus said nothing, letting the silence stretch. Richard continued, voice shaking. "Bellevue Steakhouse is suffering. The staff, innocent people, are losing their jobs. If this continues, we'll have to shut down permanently." Marcus finally leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "And what do you want from me?" Richard hesitated. I was hoping you'd consider issuing a statement. Something saying that you forgive the restaurant, that we made an error in judgment, but we're working to correct it. It might stop the boycott." Jamal snorted. "You want him to fix your mistake?" Richard flinched but kept his eyes on Marcus. "I know I don't deserve your help, but please, I'm begging you." Marcus tilted his head, considering. Then he smiled. "All right, Richard. I'll make a public statement." Richard exhaled, relief flooding him. "Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Evans. You won't regret this." Marcus stood, walking around his desk. He placed a firm hand on Richard's shoulder. "But first," Marcus said softly, "I need you to do something for me." Richard tensed. "Of course. Anything." Marcus leaned in, his voice a whisper. "I need you to resign from Bellevue Steakhouse. Effective immediately." Richard's breath caught in his throat. "What?" "You see, Richard." Marcus smiled, but his eyes were cold. "I don't want to save Bellevue. I want to own it." Richard's face went pale. Marcus continued. "In less than 48 hours, I'll be purchasing Bellevue Steakhouse at a fraction of its worth. I already have the board's approval. But there's one loose end, you." Richard opened his mouth, but Marcus cut him off. "You have a choice, Richard. Step down quietly, and I'll let you leave with your dignity. Refuse, and I'll make sure you never work in this industry again." Richard's knees nearly buckled. This wasn't a negotiation. This was execution. "Fine," Richard whispered, his voice hollow. "I'll resign." Marcus patted his shoulder. "Smart choice." Richard turned to leave, feeling the walls close in on him. As he reached the door, Marcus spoke one last time. "Oh, and Richard?" Richard paused, gripping the doorknob. Marcus smirked. "Next time, be careful who you underestimate." Richard walked out, his entire career in ruins. Marcus sat back in his chair, watching the city lights. Tomorrow, Bellevue Steakhouse would be his. But he wasn't done yet. The city woke up to a bombshell headline. Bellevue Steakhouse sold to Marcus Evans for pennies on the dollar. By noon, the restaurant was officially his. The takeover was swift, ruthless, and completely legal. The board had caved under the pressure. With customers boycotting and sponsors withdrawing, they were bleeding money. Marcus had made them an offer they couldn't refuse. And now, Bellevue Steakhouse belonged to the very man they had once humiliated. Marcus stood outside the restaurant, watching as the old sign was ripped down and replaced with a sleek new one. Evans Prime Steakhouse. The irony wasn't lost on him. As workers moved in to begin renovations, Marcus turned to his assistant, Jamal. "Where's Richard Hastings?" Jamal smirked. "Packed up his office and left this morning. I heard he's looking for work, but, no one's calling him back." Marcus nodded, satisfied. He hadn't needed to ruin Richard. Richard had done that himself. But Marcus wasn't done. There was still one last piece of unfinished business. Across town, Thomas Bellevue sat in his home office, drowning his sorrows in whiskey. His restaurant, his legacy was gone. In just 72 hours, he had gone from a respected business owner to an outcast. His name was plastered on every news station, dragged through the mud as a symbol of outdated racism. He had tried to save it. He had begged investors to reconsider. But the damage was too deep. Now, he was ruined. A knock at the door made him flinch. He wasn't expecting visitors. Cautiously, he set down his glass and walked to the front door. When he opened it, his stomach dropped. Marcus Evans stood on his porch, dressed in an impeccable black suit. He looked like a man who had already won. And he had. "What do you want?" Thomas gritted his teeth. Marcus smiled. "To talk." Thomas wanted to slam the door in his face. But something in Marcus's calm demeanor made him hesitate. He stepped aside. "Make it quick." Marcus strolled inside, glancing around. "Nice place. Must have cost a fortune." Thomas tensed. "If you came here to gloat, I came here to make you an offer." That caught Thomas off guard. "What kind of offer?" Marcus turned, his expression unreadable. "I don't just want the restaurant, Thomas. I want everything. Your entire brand. The catering business. The recipes. The liquor licenses." Thomas scoffed. "You already took my restaurant. That wasn't enough." Marcus's smirk didn't waver. "I don't take. I buy. And I always get what I want." Thomas shook his head. "I'd rather die than sell you my family's brand." Marcus simply shrugged. "That's unfortunate. Because once I open Evans Prime, Bellevue Steakhouse will be a distant memory. I'm bringing in the best chefs, the finest cuts of meat, and a luxury experience people will actually want to pay for." He stepped closer. "You'll be a footnote in history, a lesson in what happens when you underestimate the wrong man." Thomas's jaw clenched. Marcus continued. "Or you could walk away with a deal. You hand over everything, and in return, I'll make sure you leave this city with something to your name." Thomas laughed bitterly. "You expect me to trust you?" Marcus's expression darkened. "I don't care if you trust me. I care if you're smart enough to know when you've lost." Silence hung between them. Thomas knew he had no leverage, no allies, no future. He exhaled, defeated. "How much?" Marcus smiled. "That's more like it." A week later, Evans Prime Steakhouse was fully operational. It had taken only days to erase Bellevue's name from history. The menu was upgraded, the decor modernized, and the staff was retrained under a new code of ethics. But the grand reopening? That was where Marcus had his final move planned. The guest list was exclusive city officials, celebrities, business moguls. But seated at the best table in the house? Marcus's family. The very same family that had been turned away only a week before. His mother, dressed elegantly in a silk gown, smiled as the staff, now impeccably polite, poured her a glass of the finest wine. Marcus raised his own glass. "To new beginnings." His mother smiled proudly. But as they toasted, Marcus's eyes landed on one last familiar face. Richard Hastings, the former maitre d', stood near the bar, watching the celebration from a distance. He looked like a ghost of his former self. His usual confidence was gone, replaced with quiet humiliation. Marcus set down his glass and walked over. Richard stiffened as Marcus approached. "You're here," Marcus noted, his voice unreadable. Richard swallowed hard. I needed a job. No one else would hire me." Marcus studied him. The once arrogant man now stood before him, stripped of all power. Richard cleared his throat. I'll work hard. I swear. Marcus tilted his head. Then, with a small smirk, he nodded toward the kitchen. Dishwashing station. If you're serious, you start tonight. Richard's face burned with shame, but he nodded. Thank you. Marcus said nothing, just turned and walked away. Justice had been served. But as Marcus sat back at his table, his phone buzzed. A text message. Unknown number. You think this is over? You have no idea what's coming. Marcus's eyes narrowed. A new challenge was on the horizon. And this time, the battle had just begun. Marcus's story is far from over. What happens next will shock you. If you don't want to miss the next chapter, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Stay tuned for part 2.